Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into the fascinating world of medieval peasants, the unsung heroes of history. These individuals, despite facing some of the harshest conditions, managed to endure some of the coldest, most brutal nights ever recorded. From ingenious ways of insulating their homes to clever strategies for sharing warmth, their story is one of determination, grit, and sheer survival. Before we jump in, make sure to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy the content, and don't forget to subscribe. Only if you genuinely appreciate what I do here, of course. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far we've come and connecting with viewers from all around the world. All right, now that we've got that out of the way, let's dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some calming background noise, and settle in for tonight's journey. When you think about medieval life, the images that likely come to mind are knights in shining armor, grand feasts, and festive fairs, right? But for the average peasant, winter wasn't about enjoying the seasonal cheer, it was a battle for survival. It wasn't just a cold season, it was a grueling test of endurance that came every single year, like a relentless teacher with no mercy and no extra chances. Imagine this. You live in a small, cramped hut made of mud and sticks. The walls are so thin that you could probably hear a bird sneeze outside. There's no insulation, no real windows, just a small hole in the wall stuffed with animal skin to keep out the wind. There's no thermostat to adjust. The temperature inside your home? Well, it's usually just a few degrees warmer than what's happening outside. So if it's freezing outside, it's probably still pretty close to freezing inside. Now let's talk about the nights. They were the absolute worst. Darkness would completely consume everything. The wind would howl through the cracks like an angry ghost, and the fire in the hearth would flicker weakly, trying its best to keep you warm, but mostly just roasting the toes of whoever was closest. If you were on the other side of the room, good luck might as well have been camping outside with nothing but the chill and your thoughts for company. And if you think clothing might help, think again. Peasants didn't have luxury fur coats or down blankets to bundle up in. You had a couple of wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled like goat, and the hope that if you layered enough, you might somehow create a human version of an onion. Spoiler alert, it didn't work very well. Forget about comfy bedding too. You might have slept on a pile of hay stuffed into a sack, or if you were really lucky, maybe some old rushes on top. And just for fun, you'd probably get some fleas thrown in for free. If you're looking for luxury, medieval peasant life wasn't exactly the place to find it. But the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Things like frostbite, hypothermia, and the very real threat of freezing to death were constant worries, especially for the young and the elderly. Every morning that you woke up still alive was considered a small miracle. In fact, it was worth celebrating, maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving winter as a medieval peasant wasn't about comfort. It was about surviving, gritting your teeth, piling on as many clothes as possible, huddling with your livestock for warmth, and praying you didn't wake up with ice hanging off your face. And the fun didn't stop there. If you think your house is drafty because of a cracked window, medieval peasants had a whole different level of drafty to contend with. Their homes weren't just drafty, they were basically wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant homes were built using a construction method known as wattle and daub, which is a fancy way of saying sticks crisscrossed together like a big basket, smeared with a mix of mud, straw, and you guessed it, animal dung. Yes, dung. It wasn't gross for the sake of being gross. It was cheap, easily accessible, and surprisingly effective as an insulator. But no matter how well the walls were smeared, they didn't stand much chance against a proper winter storm. The wind would find every little crack and gap and come right on in, swirling through the house and making sure you never got too cozy. Privacy? Forget about it. Warmth? Also a no-go. Character building? Absolutely. Then there were the roofs. Those thatched roofs looked picturesque, sure, But after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally allowed local wildlife to move in. Nothing quite says home sweet home like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner. Windows, when they existed at all, were laughably tiny and covered with animal hides or wooden shutters. And glass? It was so expensive that even the lord of the manor might only have a tiny shard in his house. For peasants, they were just hoping the wind didn't rip the animal skin off the wall in the middle of a blizzard. To make matters worse, floors were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, the dirt would turn to mud and seep into the home. Technically, you could call it indoor water features, but not exactly the kind of luxury you'd see in a modern spa. In winter, every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh cold from below. Cold from above. Cold from everywhere. It was a three-dimensional assault on your body heat. But medieval peasants didn't whine. They packed the gaps with moss, stuffed old rags into the worst drafts, and huddled together like a big human insulation blanket. Because if your house was falling apart, and your best defense against the cold was mud and goat hair, you might as well try to find humor in it. That is, if your teeth weren't chattering too loudly. As if the cold air wasn't enough, peasants also had to battle an even sneakier enemy, rising from below the frozen ground. Floors weren't really floors back then. They were just flat patches of dirt. If you were lucky, you might have a few layers of straw or rushes spread out, but these floors did little to keep the cold from seeping up into your bones. And if you dropped something, well, consider it a permanent part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this brutal cold in a few different ways. One of the most common methods was layering thick mats of straw across the floor, assuming you could afford to. Or, more realistically, if you could swipe enough straw from a neighbor's field without getting caught, you might have a decent insulating barrier. The problem was, straw flattened quickly, got moldy even faster, and gave the room a distinct, crunchy soundtrack. If straw wasn't available, dried rushes were a popular alternative. Over time, the rushes would get trampled and accumulate dirt and food scraps, creating an unfortunate breeding ground for fleas and whatever other pests decided to make themselves at home. Imagine sleeping on a floor that was essentially a living ecosystem. It was like medieval carpet padding, except your carpet was alive, damp, and smelled like wet dog. If you were really lucky, you might also get some bugs for company. Now, let's talk about the beds. For most peasants, beds weren't the cozy, supportive places we think of today. They were often little more than rough wooden frames stuffed with straw or hay. No memory foam, no comfy blankets, just crunchy, uncomfortable layers that were as likely to make you itch as they were to help you sleep. Some peasants didn't even bother with a bed frame. They just threw the straw directly onto the dirt floor. At least this way, you got to experience earth-connected slumber, which modern influencers would probably try to market as a wellness trend. But back then, it was just a harsh reality. The straw mattresses were also temporary. Over time, they'd flatten, grow moldy, and become a health hazard. Replacing the straw wasn't exactly a weekly chore either. It was usually done a couple of times a year, unless the situation got unbearable, or your bed decided to start moving on its own. Fresh rushes were often thrown on top of the old ones without bothering to clean them out first. Eventually, this created a living carpet of decomposing plants, dirt, fleas, and whatever else managed to sneak in. But at least it kept the cold from directly reaching you. And let's be honest, staying warm was the real luxury. If you woke up with a few flea bites, well, that was just part of the experience. If you did have the luxury of an actual bed, chances were it wasn't much better. It was usually a basic wooden frame with a layer of straw or hay stuffed inside, and if you were really lucky, some old rushes on top. In other words, not a mattress that would make you feel like you were sleeping on a cloud. Sleeping wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. You had to shuffle around, tossing and turning to keep the blood flowing, and avoid freezing the side of your body closest to the cold ground. And if you were lucky enough to not wake up with icicles hanging from your eyelashes, you were doing better than most. But what about clothing? Surely that could help keep you warm, right? Well, not so much. Peasants didn't exactly have access to luxury woolen cloaks or goose-down jackets. They layered up with whatever they could find, wearing rough wool tunics. And if you had it, a cloak that, let's just say, had a distinct goat smell. The key to surviving medieval winters was all about layering. The more layers you could pile on, the better. Of course, that didn't mean it was going to be a comfortable night. More often than not, the layers were itchy, heavy, and didn't do much to stop the cold from creeping in. But hey, it was better than nothing. Footwear wasn't much of an upgrade either. Boots were a luxury. Most peasants wrapped their feet in cloth or old rags, then stuffed them into wooden clogs or simple shoes. If the cold still managed to bite through, you just added another layer of cloth and hoped for the best. And washing your clothes in the winter, that was a whole ordeal. You had to drag them to a frozen stream, smash through the ice, and hope they didn't freeze into an unmovable sheet of linen. If you were lucky, you could dry them out by a fire, assuming the fire hadn't already died out by the time you got back. If not, well, just layer up, and that grime would provide a nice extra layer of insulation. But again, that's just part of the deal. Hygiene wasn't exactly top of mind either. Bathing? Rarely happened. You'd get a good scrubbing maybe once a month, assuming the weather wasn't too harsh. Instead, peasants built up a protective layer of dirt and grease on their clothes, which surprisingly was a great insulator. In fact, washing too often was considered potentially dangerous. Some believed that scrubbing away the dirt made you more vulnerable to illness. So the grimy, itchy layers weren't just practical, they were a matter of survival. The constant layering wasn't just for warmth either. It was a defense against the freezing cold that seemed to come from every angle. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of central heating or even a fireplace in every room. They had one fire, usually in the center of the home, and if you were lucky enough to be closest to it, you could bask in its warmth. The rest of the house? Well, let's just say the further away you were from the fire, the colder it got. So what did medieval peasants do to cope with the cold? Well, a lot of the time they used sheer determination and a bit of creativity. They packed gaps in the walls with moss, stuffed old rags into drafts, and huddled together for warmth. And yes, sometimes that meant bringing in the livestock. Chickens, goats, and even cows were allowed inside for the night, creating a chaotic but warm living space. The animals weren't just pets, they were a vital part of surviving the harsh winter. If you thought your roommate was a nightmare, try sharing a bed with a goat. The smell, the noise, the general discomfort living with livestock wasn't exactly glamorous, but it was a necessary sacrifice when the temperature plummeted. The animals added precious body heat, and if your goat was close enough, it might even prevent it from being stolen by your neighbor. But let's face it, the downside was a little more stinky than cozy. But it wasn't just the animals that provided warmth. If there were enough bodies close together, it wasn't unusual for entire families to huddle together like a human lasagna for warmth. The strongest, warmest members of the family might be placed on the outside, like human shields against the cold, while babies and elderly people were tucked in the middle, where the heat would be most concentrated. On the coldest nights, privacy wasn't even a consideration. It was about survival. The goal wasn't to sleep comfortably, it was to wake up with all your limbs intact, without frostbite. Forget about having your own space or personal room. If you weren't huddled with your family, you were probably surrounded by other people, neighbors, and maybe even livestock, everyone piled together for warmth. So forget about the idea of sleeping with your elbow room. The real challenge was making sure you didn't end up as the cold one on the edge of the pile. As much as the communal sleeping helped with the cold, it didn't solve all of medieval life's problems. The constant contact with others, the lack of privacy, The crowded, unsanitary conditions, all of that led to a variety of challenges. Fleas were a constant companion, especially in homes with animals. And in the absence of regular bathing, you were never far from the smell of sweat, smoke, and animals. But as unpleasant as it was, this was reality for the average peasant during winter. Cleanliness wasn't really a priority, and if you had a warm fire, a couple of layers, and a roof over your head, you were ahead of the game. But even if you had all that, it didn't mean you could simply sleep through the night. The cold wasn't the only issue. Your home was also a constant battle against the elements. Between drafty walls, leaky roofs, and the cold earth beneath you, your hut wasn't a sanctuary. It was more like a fortress you had to constantly shore up against the relentless forces of nature. The cracks in the walls were a battlefield where every stuffed rag and moss pile represented a tiny victory over the freezing wind outside. The roofs were just as much of a struggle. As the thatch sagged, leaked, and let in all sorts of unwelcome creatures, peasants didn't just ignore the problem, they worked constantly to patch them up. If a roof started leaking, it wasn't just a small inconvenience. It was another issue that could make the difference between life and death. But these roofs weren't all bad. They provided a space for the family to gather, not just to sleep, but to cook, socialize, and get through the long, dark nights. Most homes didn't have separate rooms, so everyone slept, ate, and worked in the same space. The fire pit in the center was usually the heart of the home literally. It provided light, warmth, and the ability to cook. But there were downsides to this as well. Most medieval homes didn't have chimneys, so the smoke had to go somewhere, usually into the room where the family lived and slept. You might have been warm, but you also spent most of your time breathing in smoke, soot, and the occasional uninvited guest, like a rat or a bird that managed to sneak in. Despite all this, peasants were masters of making do. If you didn't have enough food, you made do with what you had. If your roof leaked, you stuffed the cracks with what you could find. And when the cold was too much to handle, you huddled up with your family and whatever animals you could squeeze into the hut with you. The creativity and resourcefulness that medieval peasants displayed in order to survive the cold winter nights is truly remarkable. They didn't have the modern conveniences we take for granted, yet they found ways to get by and even thrive in the harshest conditions. Now, speaking of food, one of the most surprising strategies medieval peasants had for surviving the winter was their diet. You might think that food during this time was scarce, and in many cases it was. But medieval peasants knew the importance of calories. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. If your body wasn't properly fueled, you wouldn't survive the night. So meals were focused on foods that were hearty, filling, and slow to digest. Think thick stews with root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions. You had grains like oats and barley, which were used in porridge or bread. And if you were especially lucky, maybe a bit of salted meat if it was the right time of year. Food wasn't just about nourishment, it was about survival. Foods that took longer to digest were essential because they helped your body generate heat over time. Fatty foods in particular were highly valued. The slow-burning heat they provided helped keep your body warm throughout the night. And this wasn't just about eating a lot, it was about eating smart. A full stomach at night meant more warmth, which meant more of a chance to survive the cold. But let's be clear, this wasn't gourmet cooking. Medieval peasant meals weren't meant to be comforting or delicious. They were just meant to get you through another night, another cold day. If you had to eat a mushy, flavorless turnip stew, so be it. The real luxury was in the fact that you had food in the first place, and sometimes the best you could do was stuff yourself with whatever was available and pray that your body could handle it without freezing overnight. As for the kind of food you ate, there was a big difference depending on where you lived. In coastal areas, fish was an important part of the diet. In the fields, grains, beans, and vegetables were key. Meat, especially fresh meat, was reserved for the wealthier classes. For peasants, meat was more of a rare treat than an everyday food. If you had meat, it was often salted, dried, or smoked to preserve it for the colder months. And if you think that eating a hearty meal was the end of your survival tactics, think again. Medieval peasants also developed some pretty creative tricks to keep warm at night, like using heated stones or hay boxes. You might not have had electric blankets or portable heaters, but you could always warm up a stone in the fire and slip it into your bed to keep the chill away. The hay box was another medieval innovation, a wooden box lined with hay used to keep food warm. Peasants realized if it could keep food warm, it could also keep you warm. They would use these warm stones to heat their bedding or just huddle up with them for warmth. As clever as medieval peasants were, sometimes the cold was simply too much to fight off. Imagine the struggle of keeping the fire alive during the winter nights. It wasn't as simple as just throwing a few logs onto the hearth and calling it a day. No, it was a constant battle to keep that fire burning, especially when you didn't have a fireplace with a chimney to funnel the smoke outside. Most peasants had to deal with a fire that smoked up the entire room, adding to the discomfort of the already freezing conditions. The fire itself wasn't just about warmth either. It was the center of life in the home. It was where meals were cooked, where the light came from, and where everyone gathered during the long nights. But keeping that fire alive wasn't a simple task. It required constant attention, adding wood, poking the embers, and even using flint and steel to rekindle it if it went out. And you can imagine, that's not an easy thing to do in the middle of a freezing night, half asleep, with fingers so numb you can barely grip the tools. If you let the fire go out overnight, you were essentially inviting the cold to take over. So, many peasants developed a strategy called banking the fire. This wasn't about saving up money, it was a way of keeping the embers alive until morning. Before going to bed, they would carefully bury the embers under a mound of ash to keep them insulated. The idea was that the ash would act like a blanket, keeping the fire just barely alive. In the morning, all you had to do was uncover the pile, add some fresh wood, and you'd have fire without having to go through the exhausting process of starting one from scratch. Banking the fire was an art form, and it was a skill passed down through generations. Some people swore by using dry ash, while others insisted that a little moisture in the ash helped keep the embers burning. It was a delicate process, and getting it wrong could leave you with a cold, dark morning. But if you got it right, you could wake up to a fire that would take the chill out of the air and make the whole day feel a little more bearable. Even if you managed to keep the fire going, it wasn't always enough to ward off the cold. The house itself, after all, was no better than a drafty shell. The wind would find every gap in the walls and floor, blowing through the cracks and turning every night into a fight for warmth. So peasants did what they could to seal up their homes, stuffing cracks with moss, rags, and old clothes. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't always effective, but it helped. The roofs were another constant challenge. They might have looked nice when they were first built, but after a few years of rain and snow, those thatched roofs sagged and leaked. Peasants were forced to patch them up, often using anything they could find, old cloth, bundles of grass, or even chunks of turf from the field. Sometimes it seemed like the house was just as much of a project as the people who lived in it. If the wind didn't get to you, the roof might, or the cold ground beneath you. The entire structure felt like it was slowly falling apart, but somehow, through sheer will, peasants managed to keep their homes standing through the winter months. And speaking of falling apart, let's talk about the floors for a second. As we've mentioned, most medieval homes had dirt floors. While some might have added straw or rushes to soften the surface, the cold would still creep up from below, making the floor just as inhospitable as the walls or roof. If it rained, the ground would turn to mud, and you'd end up walking through puddles in your own home. That meant your bedding was constantly damp, your clothes were never quite dry, and the air in the room was thick with the smell of wet earth. But as much as these challenges were a part of daily life, medieval peasants weren't the type to give up. They learned how to survive with what they had, making the most of their limited resources. They understood the importance of working with the land, not against it. They were masters of making do with what was available, and in the face of all this hardship, they found ways to make their homes as warm and as safe as possible. But survival wasn't just about making your home as weatherproof as you could. It was also about how you dealt with the elements outside. Winter wasn't just a cold season, it was a time of real danger. The risk of frostbite, hypothermia, and death by freezing were constant. Children, the elderly, and the sick were especially vulnerable. Getting through the winter was never a guarantee, and waking up in the morning wasn't something to take for granted. Every morning that you were still alive was seen as a small victory, a reminder that you'd made it through another freezing night. While peasants didn't have the luxury of modern medicine or even the most basic comforts, they did have something just as powerful: their resilience. They learned to adapt to their environment, to find creative ways to stay warm, and to rely on each other for support. Survival meant huddling together, literally and figuratively, to make it through the night. You couldn't rely on much, but you could always rely on your family, your neighbors, and sometimes even your livestock to help you get through the harshest of winters. And speaking of livestock, let's take a moment to discuss the role they played in medieval winter survival. Cows, goats, sheep, chickens, these animals weren't just a source of food or income. In the winter, they were part of the family. They were kept inside the home to provide warmth. Yes, it wasn't exactly pleasant to sleep next to a goat or a cow, but every little bit of body heat helped. These animals became a vital part of surviving the bitter cold. And in a world where food was often scarce and the risks of starvation were high, having livestock inside was not just a luxury, it was a matter of survival. In some ways, the relationship between peasants and their animals was symbiotic. The animals helped keep the family warm, and the family kept the animals protected from the cold, feeding and tending to them as best as they could. There was a kind of unspoken partnership, one where everyone did their part to make sure that no one froze to death. While the winter was harsh, the community and family bonds were what helped medieval peasants endure. People depended on one another, not just for warmth, but for food and resources. There wasn't much in the way of privacy or personal space, but when the cold was so severe, no one could afford to go it alone. If your fire went out, you didn't just sit there and freeze. Your neighbors would come over with a glowing coal wrapped in rags, or maybe even invite you into their overcrowded home for the night. It was a matter of survival, yes, but it was also about community. Everyone pitched in, and no one was left out in the cold for too long. That said, there were still plenty of challenges that came with sharing your space so closely. The winters were long, and with multiple people in a small hut, tempers could flare. The lack of privacy would drive even the most patient person to the edge. Every night you might find yourself sharing your blanket with a snoring cousin, or maybe a livestock animal that had snuck in for the warmth. If you were unlucky, you'd be the one stuck on the edge of the pile, trying to avoid the cold drafts near the door. But even amidst all this discomfort, there was humor. As much as the conditions were tough, peasants didn't have much else to do but laugh and make the best of things. They had no choice but to be resourceful and adaptable. If the fire went out, they would find a way to light it again. If the wind was too fierce, they'd block it with whatever they could find. If their bedding got too dirty, they'd just layer more on top of it. The cold was always there, and so was the grind, but peasants found ways to keep their spirits up, even if it was just by sharing stories or gossiping around the fire. The way people lived, fought, and worked together reflected a deep sense of determination. No matter how bad it got, no one gave up. The survival tactics medieval peasants employed were rooted in practicality and creativity. Their days were full of hard labor, from tending to the animals to fixing the roof or harvesting whatever food they could find. They lived simply, but they didn't live recklessly. Every decision they made, whether it was about insulating their home, deciding what to eat, or even how to sleep, was carefully thought out to maximize their chances of survival. So when winter came around, peasants didn't just brace themselves for a few weeks of discomfort. They prepared for the harshest tests of endurance. It wasn't just about surviving the cold nights, it was about making it to the spring, about getting through a season that could literally freeze you to death if you weren't careful. But they did it. They endured. And it's not just the cold that made life so difficult. Medieval peasants were also battling against hunger. Crops were often limited and food shortages were common. Many peasants lived off a diet of bread and soup made from whatever was available. Meat was a rare luxury for them, and even fresh vegetables weren't guaranteed. If you were fortunate enough to have a cow or a chicken, you might have a steady supply of milk and eggs. But if you didn't, you were stuck with whatever dried or preserved food you could find. Preserving food was crucial for survival. In winter, when fresh produce was scarce, peasants would rely on salted meats, dried fish, and root vegetables that could be stored. But those foods weren't exactly filling or tasty. The cold winters meant that there wasn't much variety, and it was hard to make do with the same few meals day after day. And let's not forget about the sheer exhaustion that came with it. After a long day of work, there wasn't much energy left for anything other than finding a place to sleep and trying to get some rest before the cold came again. But survival didn't stop at food or warmth. For medieval peasants, surviving winter also meant avoiding sickness. Illnesses like pneumonia, bronchitis, and other respiratory issues were common in the cold, damp environments they lived in. And for children, the elderly, or the sick, even a mild illness could turn deadly. But peasant life wasn't just about avoiding illness. It was about managing the constant risk that it could strike at any moment. Keeping warm, eating right, and sticking close to family were all ways to make sure you didn't end up sick and vulnerable during the long winter months. Despite all the challenges peasants faced, there was a level of grit that kept them going. They worked hard, protected their families, and faced the trials of winter head-on. There was no other choice. It wasn't about comfort or luxury. It was about living through another season, another year. The medieval peasant's life was not glamorous by any means, but it was a life defined by perseverance, ingenuity, and a deep connection to community. And even though the cold was unrelenting and the winters were long, peasants were able to carry on thanks to their ability to adapt and make the most out of whatever they had. They didn't wait for modern technologies or comforts to improve their lives. They took the tools, knowledge, and skills they had and made it work. They survived because they were resourceful, creative, and stubborn. The next time you think about how rough your day might be or how cold it gets in your home, consider the medieval peasants. They lived through winters that could freeze entire villages. Yet they found ways to not just survive, but to live with resilience. Their story is one of triumph in the face of the most extreme circumstances, and it reminds us that sometimes survival isn't about the latest gadgets or technologies. It's about finding the strength and the creativity to get through whatever comes your way. Medieval peasants knew that winter wasn't just a season, it was an ongoing battle, one that could claim lives if you weren't careful. But despite the risks, they kept going. They weren't focused on making life comfortable, as most of us would be in similar circumstances today. They were focused on surviving on, ensuring that they woke up in the morning with all their limbs intact. They may not have had the luxury of comfortable beds, ample food, or cozy clothing, but they had something more powerful: resilience. And that resilience extended to everything in their lives. From their homes, which were constantly being patched up and repaired against the cold, to their work, which was physically demanding and required a level of resourcefulness that would make today's survival experts proud. In the midst of the struggle, peasants found a way to make life as bearable as possible. They found warmth in each other, in their homes, and in their shared determination to endure. Yet despite all their resourcefulness, medieval peasants also faced one of the greatest challenges of all, the knowledge that, at any time, the cold could overpower them. They could do everything right, bank the fire, layer their clothing, seal up the cracks in the walls, and still wake up to find frost on their bedrolls or feel the piercing chill of winter invade their bones. And the thing is, that was a reality they knew they had to face. There was no modern heating, no space heaters or thick insulation. It was just a matter of layering up, huddling together, and hoping for the best. So what did this look like on a day-to-day basis? During the day, peasants worked tirelessly in the fields, tending to livestock, gathering wood, or repairing their homes. They did this even when the weather was at its worst, and when night fell, the cold intensified. But it wasn't just about enduring the cold nights in silence. Medieval peasants learned to adapt and create a sense of normalcy in the midst of hardship. They told stories around the fire, sang songs, and even found ways to laugh, all while the cold wind howled outside their walls. It was a way to keep their spirits up and remind each other that, no matter how tough things got, they would get through it together. But winter wasn't just a matter of personal survival. It was also a time when the community came together in a shared struggle. Peasants would gather to help one another, whether it was sharing firewood, repairing homes, or even providing food to families who had fallen on harder times. The strong bonds between families, neighbors, and entire villages were what made it possible to survive the harshest winters. However, even with all the support of community, the survival instincts of the peasants could only take them so far. Winter's cold had the power to break even the most determined spirit. The elderly and children were the most vulnerable, and sicknesses like pneumonia and hypothermia could take hold in the blink of an eye. Even something as simple as a poor night's sleep on cold straw could lead to a lingering illness that could prove fatal. There's a level of tragedy that comes with this kind of life. Every time a peasant faced the cold, they knew that failure could mean death. The possibility that they wouldn't make it through the winter was a constant in their minds, and yet they still pushed forward. There were no guarantees, no assurances, only the unwavering hope that they would see the sunrise the next morning. It's hard to imagine living in a world where this constant battle for survival was the norm. But for medieval peasants, this wasn't just a reality. They had no choice but to accept it. It wasn't about luxury. It wasn't about comfort. It was about living through one more night, getting through one more day, and hoping that spring would come again. For us today, it's easy to forget how difficult survival once was. With our modern heating systems, our warm blankets, and the convenience of grocery stores, we take comfort for granted. But there's something incredibly humbling about looking back at the lives of those who endured the worst winter conditions with nothing more than their ingenuity, their community, and their sheer willpower to get them through. The medieval peasants, despite their hardships, left us a legacy of resilience, a legacy that continues to remind us that, no matter how bad things get, we have the strength to survive, to adapt, and to carry on. In some ways, the story of the medieval peasant is a story of human perseverance. It's a reminder that survival isn't just about comfort, but about strength, the strength to keep moving forward, no matter the odds, no matter the weather. They faced winters that could freeze the very bones of a person, and yet they survived. They thrived in their own way by relying on each other, on their skills, and on the fire in their hearts that refused to go out. But beyond just surviving, the peasants also developed a culture of creativity in the face of adversity. They figured out how to make their homes, their lives, and their communities work with what they had. They developed heating techniques, food preservation methods, and ways of staying warm at night that we might find primitive, but they were incredibly effective given the circumstances. Their cleverness didn't just keep them warm, it kept them alive. So the next time you sit in your warm home, sipping a hot drink and complaining about the cold, take a moment to think of the medieval peasants. They didn't have central heating, electric blankets, or insulated homes. They didn't have easy access to food or medical care, but they survived. They lived through the coldest, harshest winters imaginable with nothing but their resourcefulness and their grit. Their story is one of resilience, and it's a story we can all learn from. As we look back on the lives of medieval peasants, there's one thing that stands out above all else: their ability to adapt. They didn't have the resources we have today, but they made do with what they could find. And that was often more than enough to survive. They didn't have technology to make their lives easier, but they had ingenuity, and they used it to find creative solutions to their everyday problems. Take their clothing, for example. Unlike today, where we can easily layer up in warm, soft fabrics, medieval peasants were stuck with rough, scratchy wool tunics and cloaks that smelled of goats. They didn't have down jackets or fleece blankets, and their footwear consisted of rag-wrapped feet stuffed into wooden clogs. But what they lacked in comfort, they made up for in layers. They didn't rely on one coat. They layered multiple tunics, cloaks, and blankets to trap heat and protect themselves from the cold. It might not sound glamorous, but it worked. They learned that by wearing as many layers as possible, they could at least avoid freezing to death. And they weren't just layering clothing on themselves. They made sure to protect the most vulnerable babies and the elderly by tucking them in between layers of warm bodies or covering them with extra cloaks. The communal approach to warmth, even in their sleeping arrangements, was a matter of survival. When you think about it, the need for warmth was constant. It didn't stop when you went to bed. In fact, nighttime was when the cold was at its worst. Medieval peasants didn't have soft, cushioned mattresses. Instead, they slept on beds made of straw, hay, or sometimes even just a pile of rushes. Imagine that for a moment, sleeping on a pile of itchy straw with nothing to block out the freezing air except the body heat of the people around you. It wasn't comfortable, but it was their reality. They didn't have anything resembling a modern bed with blankets that could keep the warmth trapped in. Instead, they had to rely on the warmth of their neighbors, the shared body heat from huddling together in close quarters. If you were lucky enough to be in the center of the pile, you might get a few hours of sleep before the cold seeped in. But if you were stuck on the outer edges, exposed to drafts, you might as well have been sleeping outside. And it wasn't just the cold that made winter so brutal. The floors of medieval homes were often nothing more than dirt, and that meant cold seeped up from below, as well as from the cracks in the walls. Even when they managed to block out the drafts, the ground itself was always cold. But again, the peasants adapted. They stuffed the cracks with whatever they could: moss, old rags, even animal hair to keep the wind at bay. The goal was simple: keep the cold out however possible. Food, too, was a major issue. Winter meant fewer fresh vegetables and fruits, which could be preserved only by drying or salting. The peasants didn't have the luxury of a wide variety of food. Instead, they ate simple meals like pottage, a hearty stew made from whatever root vegetables, grains, and salted meat they could scrounge together. There wasn't much variety, but they didn't have much of a choice. If they had animals, they could rely on milk or eggs to provide a bit more sustenance. If not, they made do with what they had. The key to surviving winter was working together. Peasants knew that they weren't going to survive alone. They formed tight-knit communities where everyone helped each other out. If one person's fire went out, others would come to the rescue. If someone was sick, the whole village pitched in to help. It wasn't a world where you could afford to be selfish. It was a world where survival meant working together to share resources, to lend a hand when needed, and to rely on each other for warmth, food, and protection. The communal aspect of medieval life wasn't just about helping one another out when times were tough, it was a way of life. The idea of community meant that when the going got tough, you didn't face it alone. There were no individualistic struggles for survival. Instead, peasants worked side by side, supporting each other to weather the worst of what nature could throw at them. And when you think about it, this sense of community was not just practical, it was what made it possible for medieval peasants to endure. It wasn't just about putting up with a tough winter, it was about doing it together, with resilience and support. People shared their resources and they shared their warmth. They shared their lives. And it was this interconnectedness that allowed them to survive in a time when winters were brutal, food was scarce, and life was precarious. But even though their survival relied on the community, it didn't mean that everything was easy or without hardship. Disease, accidents, and injury were constant threats. With no modern medicine, even a minor illness could become deadly. One wrong move, one slip on the ice, one careless accident with the animals, and a peasant's life could be changed forever. Yet, through it all, there was a resilience, a refusal to give in to the cold, the hunger, or the danger that defined their way of life. Peasants knew how to endure. They learned to work with the seasons, with the land, and with each other to make it through the hardest parts of the year. They didn't have much in the way of material wealth, but they had something far more valuable, the will to survive, and that was enough to keep them going. When you look at the lives of medieval peasants, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the harshness of their existence, but there's also a certain beauty in their resilience, in the way they adapted to life's challenges with grace, humor, and resourcefulness. Despite the hardships they faced, they didn't let adversity define them. They found ways to laugh, to love, and to create a sense of normalcy in the midst of difficult times. And while we might not have to face the same struggles today, there's a lot we can learn from their ability to persevere. The medieval peasants' world was shaped by necessity. Every decision, every action was about making it through to the next day, to the next season. Whether it was in their homes, their clothing, or their food, everything was designed with survival in mind. But despite the grim realities, there was always a sense of hope that guided them through the toughest of times. One of the most remarkable things about the medieval peasant's life is how they turned their environment, which might seem unforgiving to us, into something they could thrive in. They had to rely on their surroundings, making use of the natural resources available to them. They didn't have modern conveniences like heating or refrigeration, but they found clever ways to preserve food, to keep warm, and to make do with what they had. For example, while their homes may have been simple and uninsulated, medieval peasants knew how to use what was available to them to help seal out the cold. They used mud, dung, and straw to patch up cracks and create barriers against the wind. When you think about it, their homes were just as much a reflection of their ingenuity as they were of their hardship. A simple mud and dung house might seem rudimentary to us, but it was built with a deep understanding of the environment around them, with an awareness of what would work to keep them alive through the brutal winter months. But survival wasn't just about the home. It was about what they could grow, trade, and make. The medieval peasants didn't have easy access to fresh fruits and vegetables in the winter, but they knew how to preserve what they could. Root vegetables, grains, and salted meat were staples that could be relied upon when fresh food was in short supply. And while the diet may have been monotonous, it was enough to keep them going. It wasn't about gourmet meals. It was about sustenance. It was about making sure that you had the strength to get through another day. And speaking of food, one of the most impressive things about medieval peasants was their ability to stretch what little they had. The art of food preservation was vital. Dried meats, salted fish, root vegetables, and grains all became the cornerstones of their diet during the winter months. They didn't waste a single scrap of food. Everything was reused, repurposed, and made to last. Even the most humble meal could be made filling if it was prepared with care and ingenuity. Life in medieval times also meant that there was little room for waste. Everything from the animals they kept to the plants they grew had a purpose. Their clothing was made from wool or animal skins, both practical materials that could provide warmth and could be mended or repurposed as needed. If their clothes wore out, peasants didn't throw them away. They patched them, re-sewed them, and kept them going for as long as possible. It was a life that demanded resourcefulness. and it was a life that rewarded those who were willing to make the most out of what they had. In fact, some of the best lessons we can take from the medieval peasant experience are lessons about resourcefulness and resilience. These peasants didn't have the comforts or luxuries we enjoy today, but they made do. They found ways to survive, to make their homes warm, to keep food on the table, and to protect their families from the dangers of winter. They knew how to make their own luck and how to stretch every resource they had. And when the worst of it came, when the snow piled high, when the wind howled through the cracks in their homes, they didn't just give up. They huddled together, they worked together, and they endured. Their communities became their lifelines. When the cold felt unbearable, they found warmth in each other. When the hunger was too much to bear, they shared what little they had. It was this spirit of cooperation, of shared survival, that kept them going. Today we have technology that can help us survive in ways that medieval peasants could only dream of. But that doesn't mean we should forget the lessons they left behind. Their ability to adapt, to make do with less, and to rely on each other for support can still teach us something today. In a world where we often take comfort and convenience for granted, it's easy to forget how much we have. But if we take a moment to look back at those who endured without the modern luxuries we enjoy, we can see that survival isn't always about what you have. It's about how you use what you've got. The next time you're struggling to keep up with the demands of life, think about the medieval peasants. When they faced the most brutal winters in history, they didn't have fancy gear or a warm house to retreat to. But they had something that was just as important: the will to survive, the creativity to solve their problems, and the community to help them through it. That's the real lesson of the medieval peasants. It's not about what they didn't have, it's about what they did with what they had. The medieval peasants' lives may have been filled with hardship, but their ability to adapt and push through it all speaks volumes about the human spirit. When we look back on their world, it's easy to focus on the negative aspects, on the cold, the lack of comfort, and the constant struggle for survival. But if we look a little closer, we can see something else entirely. A life shaped by a deep connection to the land, to community, and to the seasons. It wasn't a perfect life by any means, but it was a life that was lived with purpose. At the heart of the medieval peasants' experience was a connection to the natural world. They didn't have the luxury of modern technology to shield them from the elements. Their homes weren't equipped with double-glazed windows or central heating. Instead, they had to rely on the earth itself to guide them through the seasons. They learned to read the signs of nature, the changing of the winds, the shifts in temperature, the signs of an impending storm, and they adapted accordingly. They knew when to harvest their crops, when to store food, and when to prepare for the worst. That connection to nature didn't just guide them in terms of agriculture, it also shaped their daily routines. They didn't have the luxury of a 9-to-5 job or weekends off. For them, survival was a daily task. They worked from dawn until dusk, tending to their animals, repairing their homes, and gathering resources for the long, cold months ahead. But their relationship with nature wasn't just about survival. It was also about respect. They understood that the land provided for them, but only if they treated it with care. They didn't waste what they had, and they made sure to preserve what they could for the future. In many ways, the medieval peasant's life was cyclical. Each season had its own rhythm, its own set of challenges and rewards. Spring was a time for planting, a time to lay the groundwork for the year ahead. Summer was about growth, watching the crops bloom and the animals thrive. Fall was a time for harvesting, gathering the fruits of their labor, and preparing for the long, harsh winter. And winter was about survival. It was about huddling together with your family, your community, and your livestock, sharing what little warmth you had and hoping that spring would come again. This cyclical rhythm wasn't just a practical matter, it was a spiritual one as well. The medieval peasants had a deep respect for the natural world, and they believed that their survival depended on their ability to live in harmony with the earth. They had their own set of rituals, often linked to the changing of the seasons, that helped them feel connected to the land and to the forces beyond their control. There were prayers for good harvests, rituals to protect livestock, and offerings to the gods to ensure a mild winter. Even their holidays and festivals were deeply rooted in the rhythms of nature. But as much as their lives were shaped by the land, they were also shaped by the community. The medieval peasants' world wasn't one of individualism. It was a world where cooperation was essential for survival. When one family's firewood ran low, the village would come together to provide more. If someone was sick, the community would pitch in, bringing food, medicine, and even their own warmth to help the person recover. This sense of shared responsibility was vital. It wasn't just about helping your neighbor because it was the right thing to do. It was about ensuring that the whole village had the best chance of survival. If one person suffered, it affected everyone. This communal spirit wasn't just about survival, it was about the bonds that held the community together. It was about creating a sense of solidarity and belonging in a world that was often cruel and unpredictable. In the absence of modern conveniences, in the face of constant threats from the elements, disease and hunger, the peasants found strength in each other. Their homes may have been small, their meals humble, and their winters harsh, but they had something that could never be taken away: a sense of community, a sense of togetherness that made the hardships of life just a little more bearable. And while the medieval peasants didn't have the same luxuries we do today, there was a certain wisdom in their way of life that we've lost in our fast-paced, technology-driven world. They understood the value of hard work, the importance of resilience, and the need for cooperation. They understood that survival wasn't just about being tough, it was about being resourceful, creative, and above all, connected. And they understood that the world was bigger than just themselves. It was a place where everything was interdependent, where every action had consequences, and where community was everything. In many ways, this is the lesson we can take from their lives. In a world that often feels isolated and disconnected, the medieval peasants remind us that community and cooperation are not just nice ideals, they're essential for survival. And while we might not face the same hardships they did, we can still learn from their resilience, their resourcefulness, and their ability to come together in the face of adversity. So the next time you're struggling, remember the medieval peasants. Remember their strength, their ingenuity, and their ability to adapt. And remember that no matter how tough things get, we always have the power to survive, to adapt, and to come together. Looking back at the medieval peasants' lives, it's easy to focus on the difficulties they faced, but their resilience teaches us more than just survival. It teaches us how to live with purpose in difficult circumstances. They didn't have the luxury of time or comfort to think about abstract goals or aspirations. Instead, they focused on the immediate, on getting through the day, on surviving the winter, and on making sure their community stayed intact. In today's world, it's easy to get caught up in our own struggles. We have challenges of our own work pressures, family responsibilities, financial struggles, and so on. But what the medieval peasants can teach us is how to approach these challenges with a clear, practical mindset. They didn't let their difficulties overwhelm them because they understood that the only way to survive was to focus on what they could control, to adapt to what the world threw at them, and to stay connected to each other. They didn't look for perfect solutions. They just found ways to keep going no matter what. One of the most profound aspects of their survival was their relationship with time. In the modern world, we're often told that we need to manage time, to make the most of every minute. And while time management is important, it can also lead to a sense of pressure, of constantly rushing from one task to the next. For the medieval peasants, time wasn't something to be managed, it was something to be worked with. They had the luxury of living in harmony with the natural cycles, not constantly battling against the clock. Their year wasn't divided into a neat set of months with deadlines, appointments, and digital calendars. Instead, it was shaped by the seasons, the time for planting, the time for harvesting, and the time for surviving the winter. The rhythm of life was dictated by the land, and as much as it required hard work and ingenuity, it also offered a natural pace that allowed them to focus on the essentials. They didn't rush through life. They lived with it. In a way, this slower, more deliberate pace of life allowed them to take things one step at a time, giving them the mental space they needed to endure whatever challenges came their way. The medieval peasants were also masters of efficiency. They didn't have the technology we have today to make life easier, but they made up for it with sheer ingenuity. They were expert craftsmen, farmers, and traders. They knew how to make the most of every tool, every piece of material, and every bit of land they had. They knew how to build homes that could withstand the elements, how to preserve food for the winter, and how to make clothing that would keep them warm in the harshest conditions. Every action, no matter how small, was intentional, designed to support their survival. And even though they didn't have access to the advanced technology or knowledge we have today, they still found ways to make the best of their situation. Their homes might have been simple, made of mud and dung, but they knew how to use these materials effectively. The thatched roofs and animal skin windows may not have seemed luxurious, but they kept the cold out. Their clothing might not have been as comfortable as modern winter wear, but it served its purpose. Their food may have been basic, but it was enough to fuel them through the toughest months of the year. They didn't have the luxury of choices. They worked with what they had, and they made it work. This efficiency is something we can learn from today. In our fast-paced world, we often feel the pressure to buy more, to consume more, to do more. But the medieval peasants remind us that sometimes the most efficient way to live is to simplify, to make do with what we already have, and to focus on the things that truly matter: our health, our relationships, and our sense of community. The way they used every resource to its fullest is a lesson in sustainability. Whether it was growing their own food, making their own clothing, or building their homes with local materials, they lived in a way that was in sync with the land. They didn't waste everything had a purpose. And even when they had to make sacrifices, they did so in a way that ensured their survival. They knew that there was no room for waste, not when their lives depended on it. But what made their way of life so effective wasn't just their resourcefulness, it was their attitude toward hardship. They didn't see hardship as something to be feared or avoided. They saw it as a challenge to be met head-on. Whether it was a cold winter, a poor harvest, or a health crisis, the medieval peasants didn't shy away from difficulty. They faced it with grit and determination. They learned to adapt, to find solutions, and to keep moving forward. That mindset is something we can all carry with us. In today's world, we often face challenges that feel insurmountable: work problems, personal issues, financial struggles. But instead of letting those challenges define us, we can take a page from the medieval peasant's book and approach them with the same resilience and determination. Just like they did, we can focus on what we can control, adapt to the situation, and keep moving forward. And if the medieval peasants had one thing that kept them going through it all, it was hope. Hope that the sun would rise again, hope that spring would come, hope that they would survive the winter, and hope that their families, their communities, and their way of life would endure. Even in the darkest of times, they held on to that hope. And it was that hope that gave them the strength to face another day. The resilience of the medieval peasants can teach us a lot about the importance of hope in our own lives. They lived through incredibly difficult conditions, yet their ability to keep pushing forward day after day was fueled by a belief that things could get better. They didn't have the luxury of instant gratification or modern comforts, but they had something just as powerful: the belief that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little easier, and that the community they were part of would make it through together. In today's fast-paced modern world, it's easy to forget the importance of hope. We live in a society where we're used to things happening quickly, instant information, fast food, rapid responses. But in the medieval world, hope wasn't something you could rely on from external sources. It was something you had to cultivate from within. It was about waking up each day, facing the elements, and doing what needed to be done to survive. And even in the worst of times, hope kept the peasants going. Their version of hope wasn't a vague dream for the future. It was practical. Hope meant knowing that the crops would grow if they worked the land, that the animals would be there to feed them if they cared for them, and that the community would come together to support each other in times of need. It wasn't about waiting for someone to fix things. It was about taking action, no matter how small, to ensure survival. One of the most profound aspects of their hope was their ability to look beyond their immediate circumstances. While they were focused on survival, they also understood that life was about more than just getting through the day. It was about building a future, whether that meant planting crops for next season, saving enough grain for the winter, or raising children who would carry on the family legacy. Medieval peasants understood that their actions had long-term consequences. They were working not just for themselves, but for the generations that would come after them. That kind of long-term thinking is something that many of us struggle with today. We live in a world that's focused on instant results. We want things now, and we often feel frustrated when we don't get what we want immediately. But the medieval peasants knew that sometimes the most important things in life take time. Their survival, their communities, their families, all of these things required patience, hard work, and a steady belief that their efforts would eventually pay off. Hope wasn't just about the future. It was also about finding meaning in the present. Even though their lives were tough, medieval peasants still found joy in their everyday existence. They celebrated the changing of the seasons with festivals. They gathered together for feasts, and they found comfort in the shared experiences of family and community. It wasn't about ignoring the difficulties of life. It was about finding ways to make the best of what they had and to appreciate the small moments of happiness. In the face of hardship, the peasants didn't give up. They didn't let the cold, the hunger, or the uncertainty of the future take away their sense of purpose. They found ways to keep going, to keep hoping, and to keep building a better life for themselves and their loved ones. And that's a lesson we can all learn from today. It's easy to get caught up in our problems, to feel overwhelmed by the challenges we face. But just like the peasants, we have the power to keep moving forward, to find meaning in our struggles, and to create hope for ourselves and our communities. Hope is what gives us the strength to get up every morning and face the day. It's what keeps us going when things get tough, and what inspires us to take action, no matter how small. And just like the medieval peasants, we can find hope in the relationships we build, the work we do, and the communities we're part of. In their world, hope wasn't something that came from external forces. It didn't come from technology or convenience. It came from the strength of their spirit, the power of their communities, and their deep connection to the land. They knew that survival wasn't guaranteed, but they also knew that they had the power to shape their own futures, one step at a time. As we look back on the lives of medieval peasants, we can see how hope sustained them through the darkest of times, and in our own lives, we can find inspiration in their ability to endure, to persevere, and to keep moving forward, no matter what. The next time you're feeling overwhelmed by life's challenges, take a moment to remember the medieval peasants. Remember their strength, their resilience, and their unwavering hope. And know that just like them, you have the power to keep going, no matter how tough things get. Looking back at the medieval peasants, it's easy to romanticize their connection to nature, their resilience, and the sense of community they fostered. But one thing that often gets overlooked is how their lives were not just shaped by nature, they also shaped nature in return. Their survival was dependent on their ability to understand and work with the land, to respect its rhythms, and to use the resources it offered without depleting them. In this sense, They were not just passive recipients of nature's bounty. They were active participants in the cycle of life and death that governed the natural world. Take their agricultural practices, for example. Medieval peasants didn't have modern machinery or advanced farming techniques, but they were experts in what they did have: their hands, their tools, and their deep understanding of the land. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, and how to rotate their crops to keep the soil fertile. They understood that the land needed to rest, that certain crops would deplete the soil of nutrients, and that others could help replenish it. They also knew that the weather, though unpredictable, played a huge role in their success, so they paid attention to the signs and adjusted their methods accordingly. Even though they didn't have the scientific knowledge we have today, medieval peasants understood the delicate balance of ecosystems. They didn't simply take from the land, they worked with it. They grew crops, raised animals, and harvested wood, but they did so in a way that was sustainable. They didn't overgraze their fields, they didn't waste resources, and they didn't use the land recklessly. They knew that if they wanted to survive, they had to ensure the land could continue to provide for them. In this way, their survival wasn't just about ingenuity, it was about respect. Respect for the land, respect for nature, and respect for the delicate balance that kept everything in harmony. This kind of relationship with nature is something that many of us have lost today. We live in a world where convenience often trumps sustainability. We've developed technologies that allow us to extract more from the earth than ever before, but at the same time, we've forgotten how to give back. The medieval peasants remind us that true sustainability comes from a partnership with the earth, not from exploiting it. And that partnership requires a deep understanding of the natural world and an appreciation for its rhythms. Their relationship with animals was also marked by this balance. Peasants didn't just raise animals for food, they raised them for companionship, for labor, and for their byproducts like wool and milk. Animals played a crucial role in their daily lives, but again, it was about more than just taking from them. It was about nurturing the animals, making sure they were well cared for, and understanding that their well-being was directly tied to the peasant's own survival. A sick animal could mean the loss of milk, wool, or even meat. So peasants took care to ensure their animals were healthy, feeding them properly, and protecting them from harm. In a way, the medieval peasants' connection to nature and animals is a stark contrast to our modern relationship with the environment. Today, we often view animals and nature as resources to be used, rather than as partners in our survival. But the peasants understood that their relationship with animals wasn't a one-way street. They depended on their animals for more than just food. They depended on them for companionship, warmth, and even protection. Animals were family in a sense, and the bond between humans and animals was essential for both parties' survival. The medieval peasants also understood the importance of preserving their environment for future generations. They didn't have the luxury of modern conservation efforts, but they instinctively understood the need to care for the earth so that it could continue to sustain them. Whether it was through crop rotation, the careful management of forests, or simply living within their means, they lived in a way that kept the balance of nature in check. They didn't overharvest or overexploit the land, they used what they needed and preserved the rest. This sense of environmental stewardship is something we can all learn from today. In a world where climate change and environmental degradation are pressing concerns, we need to take a step back and reconsider our relationship with the earth. Like the medieval peasants, we need to live in a way that honors the land, that respects its limitations, and that ensures future generations can also benefit from its resources. We don't need to go back to a medieval lifestyle, but we do need to recognize that sustainability is about more than just what we can take. It's about what we're willing to give back. So the next time you're standing outside, appreciating the beauty of nature or tending to your garden, think about the medieval peasants. Think about how they survived, not just by taking from the land, but by working with it, respecting it, and understanding it. They were pioneers of sustainability, and their way of life holds valuable lessons for us today. In the end, the medieval peasants didn't just endure, they thrived. And their thriving wasn't just about surviving the harsh winters or making it through the lean seasons. It was about building a life, a community, and a connection to the land that sustained them. It was about recognizing that survival isn't just about fighting against the world. It's about working with it, respecting it, and understanding that we are all part of a larger system that depends on balance and harmony. While the medieval peasants' survival depended heavily on their relationship with nature, it was also shaped by their sense of community. In times of hardship, when the cold and the dark threatened to overwhelm them, the bonds of community became a vital source of strength. The medieval peasant's life wasn't an isolated existence. It was deeply intertwined with the lives of others. They didn't just survive alone, they survived together. The community wasn't just a social structure, it was a safety net. In a time when disease, famine, and war were constant threats, the medieval peasants knew that they could rely on their neighbors. They shared their food, their resources, and their labor. When one family's crops failed, others would step in to help harvest what they could, ensuring that no one went hungry. If someone fell ill, the community would band together to care for them, offering what little medicine they had, as well as companionship and emotional support. This mutual support was a key factor in their survival. This sense of cooperation was a far cry from the individualism that defines much of modern life. Today, we often focus on our own personal success, our own individual achievements. But the medieval peasants understood that survival wasn't about personal glory, it was about the collective. Their communities were tightly knit, and everyone, from the youngest child to the eldest elder, played a role. In this world, no one was ever truly alone. Even in the harshest times, they knew they could turn to each other. One of the most striking aspects of this communal life was the way it shaped their daily routines. Peasants didn't live in isolated houses. Many of them lived in small, close-knit villages where everyone knew each other and worked together. The day was shaped not by individual tasks, but by collective ones. In the morning, the village would come together to tend the fields. In the evening, families would gather in the common hall for a meal, often sharing food and stories with their neighbors. Every action, no matter how small, was done with the knowledge that the success of the community depended on everyone pulling together. The bond between peasants wasn't just practical, it was also deeply emotional. In times of crisis, such as a particularly harsh winter or a devastating illness, the community would come together to support those in need. But it wasn't just about physical help, it was also about emotional solidarity. The sense of shared hardship created a unique kind of bond, one that was built on understanding, empathy, and mutual respect. When things were tough, there was a sense of comfort in knowing that others were facing the same struggles. It wasn't just the immediate family that mattered, it was the extended family of the village as well. In fact, it was often the extended family that held everything together. Elders were respected for their wisdom, while the younger generation learned from the hardships of their elders. Knowledge wasn't passed down in books, it was passed through generations of lived experience. The survival of the community depended on the preservation of that knowledge, and the villagers made sure that the lessons learned through hardship were shared with the next generation. But the bond of community wasn't just about survival, it was also about shared celebrations. Medieval peasants may have faced a hard life, but they also knew how to celebrate. The Harvest Festival was one of the most important events of the year. It marked the end of the grueling work in the fields and the beginning of the rest period. For days, the village would come together to celebrate their hard work, enjoy food and drink, and share in the collective joy of the harvest. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the sense of accomplishment that came from knowing that everyone had contributed to the bounty. Even in times of hardship, the peasants knew how to find moments of joy. They played music, danced, and sang around the fire. They told stories, passed down through generations, of heroic deeds of their ancestors and of the trials they had faced. These stories didn't just serve to entertain, they reinforced the bond of community. Through shared stories and shared experiences, the peasants forged a sense of identity that went beyond individual families. They were a people united by a shared history, a shared struggle, and a shared sense of purpose. In many ways, this sense of community is something we could use more of today. We live in a world that often feels disconnected. In our cities and towns, we may know our neighbors by name, but the sense of true community can often be lacking. We're more focused on our individual goals, our personal successes, in our own lives, and sometimes that leads to isolation. But just like the medieval peasants, we can find strength in our communities. When times get tough, we don't have to face them alone. We can reach out to our neighbors, share our resources, and offer our support. In the end, survival isn't just about how well we do on our own, it's about how well we work together. And just as the peasants proved, there's nothing more powerful than a community that comes together in the face of adversity. This isn't just about physical survival, it's about emotional survival too. The medieval peasants knew that even in the hardest of times, there was comfort in knowing that someone was there for you. Whether it was a neighbor helping with firewood, a family member offering a comforting word, or the village coming together for a shared meal, they found strength in each other. So as we face our own challenges in the modern world, we can remember the lessons of the medieval peasants. We can build communities that support each other, share resources, and find strength in collective resilience. The bonds that tie us together are just as important today as they were back then. And if we can learn to nurture those bonds, we might find that we have the strength to overcome any challenge that comes our way. Looking at the lives of medieval peasants, we also can't overlook the role of faith in their survival. In a world full of uncertainty, where danger lurked at every corner and the future was always unpredictable, faith provided not just comfort, but guidance. Their faith was deeply woven into the fabric of their daily existence. It was their compass, helping them navigate the trials of life, offering hope in the face of hardship, and fostering a sense of community that extended beyond the physical realm. For the medieval peasant, religion was not just about going to church on Sundays, it was a daily practice. Their faith was a thread that connected every aspect of their lives, from the food they ate to the work they did. They prayed before planting seeds, asking for a good harvest. They prayed before and after every meal, thankful for what they had. When sickness struck, they turned to the church for healing, seeking prayers and blessings. They were immersed in the rhythms of religious life, and in many ways their faith gave them the strength to endure. Medieval peasants didn't have access to modern medicine, technology, or resources, but they had their faith, and in a time when the world seemed unpredictable, that faith gave them a sense of control. They believed that by living a righteous life, by honoring God, and by following the teachings of the church, they could ensure their survival and prosperity. Their lives were shaped by this sense of divine guidance, and it gave them a sense of peace, even in the most difficult times. The power of faith in the medieval world went beyond personal belief. It was also a communal force. Church services, festivals, and rituals brought entire communities together. The church was often the center of village life physically, emotionally, and spiritually. It was a place of refuge, a place for shared worship, and a place where the community could find strength in their collective faith. In a time when isolation was common, the church offered connection. It was a place where peasants could gather, share their joys and sorrows, and support each other in their faith. Religious festivals were also a source of respite. The medieval peasant might have spent months working in the fields, tending to animals or battling the elements. But when the time came for a religious festival, there was a breakup moment of joy and celebration. These festivals brought the village together, offering an opportunity for the community to pause, reflect, and reconnect with their spiritual roots. They weren't just a time for religious observance, They were a time for shared joy, for music, dance, and food. It was a collective experience that strengthened bonds and renewed the spirit. But faith also provided comfort in the face of suffering. In a world where disease, famine, and death were a constant threat, the medieval peasants relied on their belief in a higher power to help them endure. Life was hard and they knew it, but they believed that suffering was part of God's plan, and that enduring hardship with grace would be rewarded. This sense of divine purpose gave them the strength to persevere. They believed that no matter how tough life got, there was meaning in their suffering, and that in the end, they would be rewarded for their endurance. This deep sense of faith in something greater than themselves is something that can inspire us today. In a world that can feel disconnected, stressful, and uncertain, faith, whether in a higher power, in our own abilities, or in the goodness of others, can provide us with strength and resilience. It gives us a reason to keep going, to find meaning in our challenges, and to believe that there is purpose, even in times of difficulty. The medieval peasants knew that the key to surviving was to hold on to something larger than themselves, and in that belief, they found the power to endure. Today, we might not rely on faith in the same way that medieval peasants did, but the lessons they impart about resilience, hope, and community are just as relevant. They teach us that we don't have to face life's challenges alone. We can turn to our communities, our beliefs, and our shared values for support. When things get tough, it's often the connections we have with others, the sense of something larger than ourselves, that help us get through. In our modern lives, where technology often pulls us away from deep personal connections, it's easy to lose sight of the importance of community and faith. But looking back at the medieval peasants, we can see just how essential those connections were to their survival. Whether it was through their relationships with each other, their connection to the land, or their deep faith in something greater, the peasants found ways to endure, adapt, and thrive, even in the face of overwhelming hardship. By remembering the ways in which the medieval peasants used faith to navigate life, we can find our own sources of strength. Faith, whether in the divine, in our communities, or in ourselves, can be a guiding force, helping us face the toughest challenges with a sense of purpose, resilience, and hope. As we reflect on the lives of medieval peasants, it's clear that their survival wasn't just about physical endurance, it was about their resilience, their ability to adapt, and their determination to make the best of what they had. They didn't have the conveniences we take for granted today, but they had something far more valuable: the ability to endure, to persevere, and to build meaningful lives in the face of overwhelming adversity. Their lives were tough. They woke up every day to work the land, care for animals, and fight against the harsh elements. They didn't have the luxury of comfort or modern technology, but they did have grit. They had creativity, and most importantly, they had hope. Hope that tomorrow would be better. Hope that their hard work would pay off. Hope that they would survive to see another day, another season, and another opportunity to build something meaningful. In many ways, their resilience can teach us valuable lessons for our own lives. We may not have to face the same kinds of hardships that medieval peasants did, but we do face challenges, whether it's personal struggles, societal issues, or the weight of modern life. And just like the peasants, we have the ability to endure, to adapt, and to find strength even when the road ahead seems uncertain. The story of the medieval peasant is one of perseverance in the face of adversity. It's a reminder that survival isn't just about getting through the day. It's about finding meaning in the process. It's about working with what we have, respecting the world around us, and finding ways to connect with others. The peasants survived not just by their own strength, but by their ability to come together, to support each other, and to adapt to the ever-changing challenges of their world. Their story also reminds us that life isn't just about comfort or instant gratification. It's about building something lasting. It's about planting seeds that will grow, tending to the land, and knowing that the fruits of your labor will come in time. The peasants didn't have the luxury of expecting immediate results. They understood that good things take time and that patience and hard work are often the keys to success. But perhaps the most important lesson we can take from their lives is the power of community. In a world where we often feel isolated, the peasants knew that they were stronger together. They relied on each other for support, for help, and for the strength to face whatever came their way. Their communities were a lifeline, a place of shared responsibility, and a source of collective resilience. In our own lives, we can learn from their example. We can build communities that support each other, share resources, and offer comfort in times of need. We can focus on building connections, finding ways to help those around us, and leaning on each other when times get tough. The power of a strong community is one of the greatest resources we have. And just like the medieval peasants, we can rely on each other to face life's challenges with courage and hope. So the next time you face a difficult situation, think back to the medieval peasants. Remember their strength, their resilience, and their unwavering determination. Remember that survival isn't just about enduring, it's about making the most of what you have, adapting to your circumstances, and finding hope in the midst of adversity. And remember that you're not alone. Just as the peasants relied on each other to survive, we too can find strength in our communities, in our shared experiences, and in the bonds that connect us all. Their story is one of resilience, yes, but it's also a story of hope, of perseverance, and of the power of community. It's a story that shows us that no matter how tough life gets, we have the strength to endure. And if we stand together, there's no challenge we can't face.